22 years old and this is your first job and you're only working remotely or you've been onboarded remotely, and you can only assess your employer through the lens of a remote employee because you never knew life at work before the pandemic.
Yeah.
That's not an easy place to be.
Yeah. I totally agree with the belonging part. I think that you want to belong to something and you feel that you have this kind of relationship. I care about this place and they care about me. And when you're doing everything by screen, it's like, yeah, I do my role, I do what I'm supposed to do, but all the additional values you could get from a group of people working together is missing. And then you're staying alone, more or less, just doing whatever you want. And that's
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. And it's particularly challenging for remote workers and the young Gen Z workers. But there's actually a big positive in this. We
Mhm.
think that organizations can learn a lot by observing their remote workers and by observing the Gen Z, the young workers. And we think organizations that want to develop a long-term healthy culture would be able to do so by really observing and studying what's happening with Gen Z. And we think the
Mhm.
best predictor of the future is to understand that generation now, because you're
Yeah.
going to get the next wave of Gen Z coming into the organization. Here in the United States, it'll be in May when they graduate college, and in Australia
Ooh.
and New Zealand, it'll be in November, December. And every year, a new wave of them enters the workforce, and they will bring their attitudes and behaviors and perceptions and preferences. And in 5 years' time, they'll be in managerial. They'll be in their first management roles, and some will be moving into leadership roles. So the more we understand them and the more we can harness their energies and their way of seeing the world, the better for organizations. But by understanding them, we can predict with a high degree of accuracy, we think, what the world will look like in 5 years' time when this generation starts to exert their control and their influence and they start to flood the workplace. We're going to get older, and
Apparently.
apparently. My father keeps saying to me, Dennis, whatever you do, don't get old. It's not much fun.
Don't do it.
But it's
My
coming, right?
my father told me nobody got out of this life alive.
There you
So
go. And so while we get older, that young generation is going to flood the workforce and they will
Mhm.
dominate eventually. So,
So what do they need to know about them? So what is like lacking from the leadership? What is the knowledge they need to know in order to be prepared for that flood, as you say?
I think it's recognition that that generation thinks differently. And here's a good way of thinking about it. So demographically, that generation is between 20 and 23 years old, something like that. But psychographically, they're the only generation alive who cannot remember 9/11. Now, everybody in this plan, I bet you and I and everybody listening knows exactly where you were, who you were with, and what you were doing when 9/11 happened.
Yeah,
Okay?
right.
It profoundly impacted our minds and our lives, no matter where we were. I was living in Switzerland, a neutral country, but it was huge the way it weighed on the country, everywhere in the
Yeah.
world, except Gen Z. They were running
Hmm.
around in nappies, completely oblivious to what was going on. And
Yeah.
then they grew up over the next 20 years and they did their study and they entered the workforce during a pandemic. So they're wired differently and they have not learned to fear for their security in the way we did. Their lives were
Hmm.
not threatened in the way our lives, were impacted. And so they come into work not concerned about things that we've always been concerned or that we've been concerned about for 20 years.
Yeah.
And yet they're the generation we see who say privacy is important, but still they share everything about their lives on
Everything.
social media, everything.
Yeah.
And so we're still trying to figure out what's going on here. How do they, on one hand, say, I'm blind to security, I care about privacy, but here's all the information about the holiday I've just been on and who I'm with and where I stayed and how long I was away from home. And here's my pet and my pet's name. So now you can guess my passwords. You know,
Yeah. Of course.
there's a lot to unpack with that generation, and we haven't
Yeah.
unpacked it all yet. We have not.
Yeah.
But
You
my
know, like
encouragement.
You mentioned the 9/11, and I'm from Israel. We have so many events to think about. It's like you have one big one, I have lots of them. But
Yes.
I think that it's not related only to personal security. It's related to the way you think about your work and about your job. My parents, they always thought about like job security. Going to a place, working for 15 years, 20 years in the same like place, and you're secure because you don't need to fight for, to make a living. And today, many of these young kids, they get what they want. It's much easier to live financially than it was in the past, especially like in the US and in Australia, for example, not in Africa. But
Yeah.
it's like it's
Yeah.
easy for them. So they're not that worried. And maybe it's good that they're not worrying. They're not thinking like 15 years from now, I need to have a pension, whatever, right?
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
it's a good thing.
It is, and you're right. Our generation was brought up to think, get a steady, stable job with some big government organization, and you'll never lose your job. The young generation now, I think, realizes that actually getting some versatile skills makes me a lot more secure and gives me more
Yeah,
freedom and adaptability than sitting in
right.
one job for a long time.
Yeah, you're right. So what do you think it's so hard to retain talent in general and these people in particular to just make them stay? If you understand it, let's say the organization understand that this is who they are. Why it's so hard to retain them, to make them like stay for 4 years? I know 4 years maybe it's too much, like 3, 4 years in the same place.
I think there's a couple of things playing out. It's the fact that change is so easy now for an employee.